Let me start with a question. Does anyone know or heard of resource nationalism as a term? Okay. It seems to be, it might be something new. Almost nationalization. Yes, this is one of the manifestations of resource nationalism. But there were a few waves of resource nationalism. You understand that resource indicates that it happens to the countries which have very rich resources, mineral as usual, and mainly it's related to oil resources, as well as to the rentier states. And nationalism is a phenomena which was, if you look at the, so this is the plan which we're gonna have today. So we'll give definitions, nature and dynamic of resource nationalism during a few decades. Then we'll discuss the theoretical approaches explaining resource nationalism. And then we'll see how does it affect the integration trends of the countries who are displaying this resource nationalism. Specifically, we'll see what happens in European Union, which is dealing with rentier states, and the ones which is particularly going through a stage of resource nationalism. So except for this very prominent case with the nationalization, as Mert Uzun correctly mentioned, nationalization of the Iranian British oil company in the early 50s, the mass phenomena of resource nationalism took place in major two waves during the turn of the century, and 70s first, in the 70s, and then in the 2000s. The Wikipedia gives the following definition of resource nationalism, that it's tendency of people and governments to assert control over natural resources located on their territory. As a result, resource nationalism conflicts with the interest of the multinational corporations. That's the most simple explanation and definition of the resource nationalism. They give various examples, mainly from South America, Bolivia, Argentina, Venezuela, and but there are various manifestations of resource nationalism and quite broadly defined concept. And it's quite broadly defined concept during this few decades when first it was noticed as a phenomenon. So first stage of resource nationalism was in 1970s as a result of the Arab oil embargo, reduced exports and raised prices in retaliation for West support of Israel in Yom Kippur War. It caused nationalization in all oil-rich states, actually across continents. At the turn of the 21st century was triggered the similar wave of resource nationalism was triggered by the high demand of energy in China and India, which led to skyrocketing oil prices. The spike of oil prices in 2003, 2008 led to whole-wide tendency in the resource-rich states to unilaterally renegotiate contracts and impose national control over long-term hydrocarbon projects. That was also happening against the background of growing strength of national oil companies. unlike in the 70s. You can divide two aspects in definitions of resource nationalism. The first one, economic. This resource nationalism emerges as a response to the high raw material prices, like high oil prices, in particular in 2000, 2008. So as a result, nationalization and even expropriations of foreign companies took place. Export restrictions were imposed, high taxation, and also cartel pricing behavior, like emergence of OPEC and all sorts of regulation and coordination in how to reduce the price, or the other way around. So the political aspect of the resource nationalism is understood as attempt to achieve greater national sovereignty. It was also the reaction to external imposition of the neoliberal policies on the global south. That's how it's understood from the political point of view. So resource nationalism re-emerged in response to neoliberalism and privatization of resources, or sometimes they connected to colonialism. So at the more micro level, the definitions of resource nationalism, which was given in a very sort of a good way by Sam Pryke, whatever we just mentioned written in Wikipedia, it's just one of basically 4 various definitions. So the first definition, which coincides with Wikipedia, it's relative control over and benefit from natural resources by the state as distinct from a foreign oil company or foreign company. Well, usually it's an oil company. The most profound effect, it's an oil company. The second group of definitions puts state is in the center. So resource nationalism is the form of economic nationalism and reflects tensions with resource liberalism. So rentier states, development states, these are national governments when they try to intervene in the international resource markets to achieve maximum benefits for the host states through selective resource policies, which would bring benefits otherwise unachievable if the markets were left to their own devices. So it's again the opposition of the states and their policy actions against the forces of market. The third expression or manifestation of resource nationalism is restriction of production by states. Here, one of the classics of the Rentier state theory, Luciani, puts his definition of resource nationalism. That's where he sort of centers his definition. He defines resource nationalism as all policies undertaken by the national government of the producing country that restricts access to resources to a subject or potential players, create separation between the domestic and international market, or directly imposes limitations to production and exports. Such policies result in lower exports. The fourth group of definitions, it's about that resource nationalism challenges policies of neoliberalism since the millennium. This group of scholars argues that there is a tendency of putting, making the resource nationalism as a positive phenomena or as acceptable forms of practice if it's developing in the rich Western or developed states, and it puts it on the negative sort of pole of the scale when it's happening in the, let's say, global South or developing state. So there is this sort of judgmental, let's say, attitude to the phenomenon of resource nationalism. So for instance, when Norway applies heavy taxes on companies, international oil companies, it's perceived as a normal practice. But when it's done somewhere in the South, then it's a resource nationalism, which is a bad practice. So the group of these scholars says resource nationalism is not associated with dodgy governments, and it's basically a normal practice, and we will encounter with that again later in our. So Luciani says that also shares the opinion that resource nationalism is a normal behavior of all producing states. It is that each producing country wants to maximize its share of rent and limit the company's share. So it's a natural sort of incentive. Resource nationalism restricts oil production, but he considers this is their right to protect their interests. He also says that access to resources may be denied absolutely on environmental or strategic grounds. For instance, US restrictions on offshore drilling or in Canada. But more frequently, this access to resources is denied to specific categories of players. Also, this access to resources might be constrained by the OPEC quotas, and restrictions may be imposed on exports to benefit domestic consumers and industrial users. He also says that they may be de facto or de jure, for instance, except for Mexico, where exclusion of foreign companies is written in constitution. Iran, in turn, prohibits production share agreements and concessions and only allows service contracts. That's also the expression of resource nationalism. There was an additional study in 2014 by Gandhi and Lean, who argued that the transfer from production sharing agreements as form of contracts to service contracts transfer is an indicator of resource nationalism. And they proved it in the case study of 8 states by researching them from 1990 to 2014. It's Venezuela, Kuwait, Iraq, Bolivia, Ecuador, Turkmenistan. Of those 8, 6 had a strong evidence that this is expression of resource nationalism, while Iran and Mexico were weak evidence. There are various cases as well. So some of them are writing these restrictions in their legal documents, but then in de facto, they are quite flexible. Some of them do not write in legal, but they can be can impose under various, let's say, excuses like Russia would impose on the environmental grounds. impose restrictions to the access of resources. So almost all of them, and so Russia would squeeze, for instance, international oil companies on case-by-case studies, and we'll come back to it. But almost all of them gave preference to the local players. Even Norway adopted partially resource nationalist stance until privatization of Statoil. Some states never resorted to nationalization, for instance, Abu Dhabi. Some resorted to partial nationalization, for instance, Libya and Nigeria. Another direction or manifestation of resource nationalism is depletion policies. So there might be conflict between the state and the international oil companies because the state might suspect that oil company is not trying to get as much, is underexploiting resources, basically. For instance, that was the reason in Iraq's nationalization in 1973. And there are also opposite. So national governments might be interested in slow development. Outside of Gulf states, all countries are concerned with maximizing their production and exports, like Venezuela, Algeria, Qatar. Chavez, after collapse of oil prices in 2008, signaled his desire to attract additional investment from international companies. Russia also, and we will, as I promised, we will discuss Russia's behavior separately. So from Yeltsin, liberal policies of Yeltsin, it moved to nationalization by Putin, which did it in a quite aggressive way with one of the major players in the oil scene of Yukos. And there was a big scandal with 10K BP, to main national company BP, under government, and took it under government control. So there were these cases as well. So in most cases, as I mentioned, motivation is rent maximization. And restriction is imposed during the increase of oil price. So many connect the resource nationalism, nationalization, expropriation, renegotiation of the terms of contracts with the international oil companies. They connect it with the rise of the oil price. Last time I told you that I'm speaking from the room, meeting room in Oxford University at St. Anthony's College, which is named after Khodorkovsky. So now I'm sitting in the room named after him, and he spent 10 years in prison. He was a owner of the Yukos private oil company in Russia, and which is a $15 billion capital. He negotiated deals with the US oil companies that would threaten, apparently, the state's monopoly on the oil exports. So peak of conflict between the state, Putin's regime, and Khodorkovsky was in 2003, and he was arrested on the charges of fraud. His Yukos company entered the bankruptcy. In the following years, its assets were sold to state-controlled firms run by Putin's close associates. So he spent 10 years in prison. Now he's free, and he's based in London. He also runs the Free Russia, if I don't confuse the name, Free Russia Foundation or Open Russia Foundation, which has a few branches in Russia, in London, I think in America too. I know him personally. He's, of course, an outstanding person, but I also think that this case of resource nationalism basically shows that it is very closely connected to the politics and political motivation. So this attack and neutralization of Mikhail Khodorkovsky was partly related to the fact that he crossed the red lines of the oligarch in Russia because he started to develop a liberal thinking in Russia. He created some think tanks, he was giving a lot of money to the educational institutions because his idea was to liberalize Russia's society, which was also, so he was getting quite active in politics also because he was funding opposition parties and decided to run for the president. So the next case liberal, Charlie asked question, is it considered the normal situation that foreign transnational companies? Well, according to the liberal and neoliberal theory of international relations, yes, that's the basis of the relationship. It's about free market. It's about free access to resources. But of course, the national governments have a right to, and that's where the major division is. Yeah. This major division is the degree to which the sovereign nations have a right to select and impose restrictions on who they cooperate with and who they don't, and choosing the criteria. And then, the other ones who consider the free market should rule. The other case was with 10KBP. I knew the people who work there too, because I was even offered the job there, which I declined. I had too much of Moscow. I spent 10 years there, so I was not going to move there again. But in 2000, one should take into account that this second sort of attack against TNK-BP took place in the time of peak of the oil price in 2008, 2009. So BP was a lawful owner, 50% stake in 10KBP since 2003. And these two guys, so first of all, they were, as he said, they were harassing the chief executive of this company, Robert Dudley, who eventually was deprived of the visa, work permit, so he had to leave. But the most importantly, they arrested two brothers, Zaslavsky brothers, who worked, one of them worked there, the other one was a free consultant. But Ilya, whom I also know quite well, They opened criminal cases. Putin's regime opened criminal cases against them for industrial espionage. And there are very many inconsistencies, as Ilya then revealed in his interviews. So both brothers got for some sort of disclosing the strategic maps of the ministry to the BP. It appeared that the ministry was the first to disclose these maps. And so it was really looked like a trumped up charges. They were on probations for 2 years, and then they eventually left for the US. Zaslavsky is now, so this was, the whole issue was viewed as a means of pressure in the sort of wave of resource nationalism in Russia to get full control of a very beneficial contract, because they were sending signals that they need to include Gazprom. And eventually Gazprom acquired the whole sort of enterprise. So because TNK BP was the third largest in Russia oil producer, and was one of 10th in the world. So it was quite a serious thing, and particularly during the rise of the oil prices. So Dudley was out. It was purchased by, the company was purchased by Gazprom. So this is just small cases of the extreme expressions of resource nationalisms in the post-Soviet space, like Russia. But these are not the only definitions of resource nationalism. So, for instance, Kaup and Geller, they say, most of the definitions explain resource nationalism as the opportunistic reaction of peripheral actors to the market cycles. But in fact, their reaction is a result of emerging powers and established hegemons supporting resource nationalism in order to secure their own material future. They bring example in Bolivia and Indonesia, that basically on emerging powers like China on the one hand and India, and the competition with already established developed states in the West, together the competition leads to sort of renegotiation of the terms, and through nationalism, resource nationalism, to the renegotiation of the contracts. They also say that resource nationalism occurs cyclically during periods of material expansion. So because global rivals offer differing opportunities to peripheral states for extraction of resources from their territories. And the other direction of the studies of resource nationalist stresses is political substance. They say that resource nationalism is less about economies, about political discourse, identity, sovereignty. That's what Charlie said also, that certain rights within the designated territory of people to dispose and to manage their resources. And it's not, resource nationalism is not just reduced to the state only. Because resource nationalism might be expressed also by non-state actors, like in murals or graffiti or political mobilization. So what are the relationships? What does resource nationalism do to the relationship between the international oil companies and host states? Some scholars, they say that it's obvious that this relationship, they alternate between conflict and cooperation. So, for instance, in period of 1970s, the relationship between host states and international oil companies were conflicting. The actors had incompatible interests, and in that period, the host states and national oil companies were dominant in this relationship. In the period of 1980s, 1990s, there were more cooperative relationship, as there was a harmony and compatible relations with the international oil companies having a dominant position vis-a-vis host states. So this Vivoda, for instance, he considers that it depends on oil prices, which were instrumental, for instance, in getting Russia and Venezuela favorable investment conditions. And during the high oil prices, resource nationalism comes to the surface. So in rising markets, the sellers gain leverage, upper hand, while in falling markets, the buyers, such as international oil companies, they get a upper hand. So the conflict is usually among over division of rents between host states and multinational corporations. I already said that there was, for instance, in 1970s, there were 83 cases of expropriation. While in 1980s, the period of cooperation, there were only 11 cases of expropriations. And the UN considered 94% of changes in the host states as favorable for the foreign investors. So it was so prominent, this disappearance of or decline of resource nationalism in the 80s or 90s, that it practically disappeared from the discourse of international relations. That was partly due to the oil price drop and privatization of state companies like in UK, Brazil, Italy, France. But there was also a boost privatization caused by the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it was sort of 80s and 90s was a sort of peak, if you want, of liberal and neoliberal discourse in their relationship. In the 2000s, there was a conflicting stage again because of the revival of resource nationalism due to the high oil prices and high degree of competition of multinational corporations with national oil corporations, as well as nationalization of the companies. So how do they explain the resource nationalism? Resource nationalism, the most popular theory which explained the resource nationalism was obsolescing bargain model. The author is a scholar from Harvard, Vernon, and in 1971, to describe the wave of resource nationalism in the 70s and accompanying widespread expropriation and nationalization, he developed this theory, which means that resource-rich developing states need investment from international oil company. So international oil companies exploit their powerful position to negotiate favorable contractual provisions. But with large upfront investments to explore and extract hydrocarbon resources and fixed assets in the country, the bargaining power shifts to the host country. So international oil corporations cannot credibly pull out of the contract if there is a dispute, because they would lose their upfront investment. So he's entrapped. I mean, not he, they're entrapped. So obsolescing bargain model predicts that the host country will increasingly have incentive to force new terms into the contract with time. And that's explanation of the mechanism of the resource nationalism. So they say that this renegotiation of terms is easy to do because countries, usually developing countries, they don't have a rule of law, which would protect the property rights. So in a sense, international oil corporations are in a weak position. And that's what was happening in 1970s. But in 2000s, there was a slightly different picture. First of all, there were less, as I said, expropriations and nationalizations. There were more negotiated solutions to contractual disputes. Producers offered international oil corporations reduced shares, which they accepted. Azerbaijan, for instance, despite weak rule of law and Rentier temptation of capturing skyrocketing revenues, has resisted drive to override long-term contractual obligations and capture rents. Then the question is, why do post-Soviet states behave differently in spite of weak rule of law? And the question is the OBM theory still actual? Is this mechanism still at work? Yes, indeed, the scholars brought it back to explain post-Soviet contractual renegotiations, as the high oil prices changed political and economic context of these long-term contracts. So post-Soviet states have taken this opportunity to renegotiate, to reassert their control over resources, demonstrate political sovereignty to their populace, increase their access to rising hydrocarbon revenue streams. So the obsolescing bargain model predicts that as long as oil prices remain high, contractual relations will be conflictual, and post-Soviet countries will continue to squeeze out international oil companies, filling state coffers with resource rents and asserting sovereignty over natural resources. But why, with rising oil prices and weak judiciaries, have many long-term contracts not been renegotiated in post-Soviet world? That means that there is something missing in this theory. And according to the other scholars, the key shortcoming of this theory is that it ignores the role of external non-legal mechanisms encouraging cooperation. So it's not just the legal mechanisms which can regulate this and affect this relationship. If cooperation adds value to reputation, it's likely to happen. So there is such a factor as, for instance, reputation of the country, because the country expects to get not only economic benefits from the further investments, but also political dividends, international support, foreign aid, and other military support. So how does one explain, as I said, stability of hydrocarbon contracts in the former Soviet Union? Bartlett in 2010 asked the question why they're not renegotiated, and are there factors other than courts to constrain the grabbing hand of the state? Yes, agree with Charlie. It's also to avoid the foreign intervention. So he brings the example of Russia and Azerbaijan as cases where the energy contracts might be enforced or their stability might be provided without the rule of law, without courts. And he names one of these factors, which he considers key factor, is reputational factor. So both countries needed investments in 1990s and to establish a good reputation. They signed contracts with a big one of the main international oil companies, but they obsolesced with the increase of oil price and large upfront investments by these international oil companies. And for instance, Azerbaijan has a high reputational motivation, or the factor was very high in case of Azerbaijan. For instance, what are these factors? One of the factors which makes country more flexible in relations with the international oil corporations, when there is a low degree of the proven resources. So it's related to the high risks, the investment in exploration, high risks. And Azerbaijan signed 20 production sharing agreement in the 90s, but only one appeared to be really serious field, as a Rentier Ganashli. It survived actually the pressure of Russia, because Russia sort of offered quite high transportation costs for the oil in the Caspian. So a lot of investments and lobbying has been dedicated to the diversifying the transportation routes, and that's how the alternative transportation route was built, Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan. So a lot of benefits came as a result of this stability of contract, in spite of the high oil prices and the weak rule of law. Azerbaijan calculated that the benefits, long-term benefits from non-renegotiating the contract are more valuable than the short-term gains for renegotiating contract and getting more stakes. So in Russia, it opened the economy in early 1990s. It was pro-FDI policies, privatization, as you remember, with Yeltsin. But then Putin came and he made this crackdown on Yukos in 2003, renationalized of most of the oil industry, increased regulation, higher taxes, increasingly conducted increasingly anti-FDI policies. So Russia returned during Putin to the higher levels of state control. But during Putin, investment conditions for international oil companies has worsened, and they turned into junior partners of Gazprom and Rosneft. So I already mentioned the dispute with TNK-BP, and Shell also exited from the Sakhalin 2 project in 2006. However, he partly considers that Russia had a medium reputational value, not as high as in Azerbaijan. So that's why it was selective in how it treated the foreign companies. So unlike Azerbaijan, Russia has large proven resource base. So international oil corporations were more motivated. Gazprom emerged as massive asset for investment and development of Russian resources. So as you remember, the strong national oil companies also is a serious factor in resource nationalism. It doesn't need international oil cooperation to secure political assistance, as it rose with the help of rents as an independent power in the world stage. Alieva, the president of Azerbaijan, he was using oil resources as a strategic tool to strengthen his power base, both in the country and externally. So by distributing shares in the contract, he was getting in turn, the loyalty or political support of the respective countries. However, in Russia, not everything was so perfect, and there are a lot of problems: underinvestment, corruption, incompetence, political interference, and other things. And there was little progress in development of the new fields, and it also used it as a political tool. And although the value of reputation has dropped since 1990s, Russia still cannot ignore its reputation. So Russia signed 3 PSAs in 1990s, 2 for Sakhalin Islands offshore fields, and 1 Khariaga in Russia's Arctic. Azerbaijan signed, as I said, 20 PSAs in 1990s, many for unproven but major, to be developed by the consortium of 11 companies, so-called AIOC consortium led by BP. And with the rising price of oil, the terms of production sharing agreements quickly obsolesced, but many PSAs were not renegotiated. So in Russia, for instance, Sakhalin contract in 1994, the contract conditions were not favorable for Russia. Low taxes, low royalties, no profit until consortium reaches 17.5% of return on capital. With oil prices growth, Russia pressed the consortium to allow Gazprom. The consortium gave minority stake to Gazprom in 2005. But Shell suddenly announced the project cost doubled. And Russia, very infuriated, decided to respond by halting the project through cancellation of all environmental permits. And there was a real serious campaign by the environmental groups on the consortium just to create obstacles for its activities. So in December 2006, Shell negotiated solutions and offered 50% plus one of stake, but for a very high price, $7.45 billion to paid by Gazprom for this share. So this was beneficial for Russia, but at the expense, of course, of reputational costs. For instance, EBRD pulled its funding from Russia, from the project, but it offered Shell, but Russia negotiated it because it offered Shell partnerships in other projects. And as a result, Shell remained operator in Sakhalin. So it just shows that Russia was calculating the reputational costs with the benefits, immediate benefits coming with the extreme renegotiation of the contract. So Azerbaijan, we have little time. I will try to finish soon. Was signed in 1994, contract of the century, so-called, was signed. Why it was called contract of the century? Because Russia, the usual dominating energy actor in the region, Russia was basically ruling the show, was given only 10% of shares in this big contract. The rest were given to the Western companies, US and European companies. So BP ended up by buying some other shares with 40% of stakes. Terms were favorable for Azerbaijan as compared to Sakhalin for Russia. And 30% of profit I was getting until BP received 16.75% rate of return and many other really good conditions. And they explained it that SOCAR, the national oil company, appeared to be a competent negotiator. So with oil price growth, there were incentives to increase rents, but Azerbaijan did not renegotiate. Moreover, it spoke about extension of the PSA beyond 30-year term. Indeed, the contract with BP was extended for another 25 years. None of the 20 PSAs were renegotiated. On the contrary, a third of international oil companies left the contracts because, as I said, they didn't discover what they expected in terms of reserves. So the conclusion from this comparative study is that dominant explanation of resource nationalism is incomplete. Stability of contracts signed in 1990s is more than a product of cost-benefit relations between host state and international oil companies, as suggests the major theory. Both Russia and Azerbaijan are acting strategically, weighing short-term benefits for negotiation, short-term benefits of renegotiating against the long-term reputational costs in a complex bargaining game with international oil companies. So it proved basically the role of reputation in hydrocarbon contract stability. And the last part of our discussion is related thus to the fact that resource nationalism might affect the incentive of integration in multilateral or regional institutions. Let's look whether it affects the regional institutions. It appeared that resource nationalism creates incentives for some regional integration if it promotes the goal of maximizing the rents. For instance, rise of regional blocs, increasingly intervening in the management of natural resources with the goal of maintaining collective resource security, was observed practically all over the world, which was taken example from OPEC, for instance. For instance, in cartel pricing behavior, South American Union of Nations or African Union were created. So there is an incentive to join efforts and cooperate to provide for collective resource security. However, when you come to the multilateral institutions, integration in which requires certain reforms and changes domestically, then when you see resource nationalism in play, which is create disincentive to integration. Let's look at the European Union. In post-Cold War, European Union had three major policies. First, EU enlargement. As you know, the former socialist bloc became members of EU. Then there was European neighborhood policies for countries, 10 countries to the south and to the east of EU. And the other one, which was part of neighborhood, but separately for the eastern states, because Sweden and Poland said, you know what, these post-Soviet states, they're actually much closer to Europe than Mediterranean, North African states, which are part of the South neighborhood policy. So we need to give them more credit and more opportunities to the greater integration in European Union. So what happened? Yeah, but if you look in the EU members and neighborhood, it was a combination of emerging economies and rentier states. To the yes, Mert. Emerging economies, which are listed, are Belarus, Bulgaria, Croatia, Estonia, Lebanon, Lithuania, Morocco, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Turkey, Ukraine. According to the World Bank, the level on income is below $11,000. And it is these countries which increase their share of manufactured goods or services by at least 0.05% between 1995 and 2000. These are criteria of putting these countries in emerging economies. And there are rentier states also. Rentier states are Algeria, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Libya, Norway, unexpectedly, Russia, and Turkmenistan among EU neighborhood. It's these countries which increase their share in exports of primary goods by more than 0.05% and which have more than 40% of their exports made of primary products. So it appeared that trade with these neighbors, both rentier states and developing states, provided for EU's resilience during the major reshuffling in the international relations, emergence of the big developing power, developing economies like China and India. So why EU, as opposed to US and Japan, showed greater resilience? Because it took advantage of being in the closer relationship and its stronger position with the rentier states and developing economies, either members of EU or the neighbors. So trade with rentier states is an important factor of EU resilience. So what's happening next? Let me just close the finish. It appeared that Eastern Partnership Program, which included 6 states of the former Soviet Union, Armenia and Georgia, Moldova, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, Ukraine, and Belarus. It appeared of 6 states which signed association agreements, were supposed to sign and to get into deeper and closer relationship with European Union. One is rentier state, and it's a first great rentier state. There are other rentier states. I consider Belarus. We already heard that Belarus is also a rentier state, as well as Armenia is also a rentier state. But first great rentier state, it's something unique in the practice of EU. And Azerbaijan still has not signed the association agreement. All the other countries, they signed. Azerbaijan has not. I mean, Belarus is sort of, in transition now. There is a non-stop demonstrations for many months. So EU is now developing special policies towards the leader of extremely delegitimized leader Lukashenko of Belarus. But what happened to Azerbaijan when they first signed the action plans of European neighborhood policy, which included the comprehensive reform package in the political, economic, and social spheres. Azerbaijan also signed the energy cooperation agreement with EU. So what happened that EU basically prioritized the energy relationship. As I said, it's very important for EU to trade with rentier states for its resilience and things like that. And Azerbaijan also played a very important role as an alternative oil and gas supplier in its policy of diversification. So with increase of the oil prices, so in 2004, Azerbaijan signed signed the action plan with EU. But then when in 2009, the Eastern Partnership program was initiated by Sweden and Poland, giving more opportunities for former Soviet states to integrate in European Union, Azerbaijan said, no, we're not interested. We're interested in strategic cooperation agreement. So experts saw this sort of behavior, which was going on against the background of the peak of the oil price, which went from 45 to 145, 35 from 145 in this 2000s. So Azerbaijan created this disincentive of integration in European Union because, first of all, didn't want to undermine its status quo, political status quo. And also it gave him the opportunity to balance the major power centers in its own favor. So many consider that resource nationalism is also the opportunity for the leaders, political leaders, and for the states to basically resist, to preserve status quo, political status quo, its power, and to resist attempts, for instance, of pressure on human rights and other policies which may undermine the stability of power. So this was happened to Azerbaijan. And basically, cooling towards EU coincided with the inflow of oil revenues during the peak of the oil price. It was also part of balancing between major center of powers, Russia and the West. And it coincided with resistance to human rights improvement and other political reform. And also it coincided with joining the non-aligned movement in 2011, which was totally contrary to the whole concept of the foreign policy of the modern nation state of Azerbaijan. So I will probably skip the comparison between Ukraine and Azerbaijan, but basically it's about that Ukraine was dependent on that the EU was using in its relationship with these countries access to trade and to the market as incentive of rapprochement and integration and reforms, but Azerbaijan was not interested because it saw EU as on the receiving end of this trade, and so that's determined or defined the outcome of this relationship, the integration of two countries, although they belong to the same sort of group of Eastern Partnership, the members, they did not. So to conclude, the question is resource nationalism back? Yeah. In 2000s, the conclusion was that resource nationalism is back at the forefront of relations between host governments and international oil companies, and it's translated into the anti-Western campaign. In the oil industry, oil producing and exporting states own and control at the moment between 77 and 90% of total proven oil reserves. That gives the basis for some scholars to assert the international oil companies' bargain has obsolesced once again. So there is a resource nationalism era in, but that was in 2000s. I mean, we have some probably different dynamic nowadays due to the fall of the oil price, but it's a separate issue. But Russia-Azerbaijan comparative study proved that countries behave strategically. And Stephen Dashevsky said, while this could be dismissed as resource nationalism, it's actually sovereign nations reestablishing their negotiating positions. They are behaving as any rational economic agent would. And to conclude about integrationist trends, there is no policy of integration of rentier state with resource nationalism in the EU. Relations are reduced to trade, due also to convergence of interests and unadjusted EU policy tools. We didn't speak too much about it, but I can answer the questions. I see already the question. Yes, could be resource within the state. Jokai, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I haven't come across the resource nationalism within the state, between the sub-state and resource owner state and the national state. That's something I should think about. Charlie, yes, there is a whole school of thought which strongly argues that the resource nationalism outside Europe is a phase of the worldwide trend of decolonization. I think there is definitely there is such a perception of the ongoing trend. The problem is that with the decline of the oil prices now, probably resource nationalism trends will be very weak, according to the theory. We still have to follow the dynamic, but for a while, at least in Russia and Azerbaijan, there are enough resources to play relatively independent game, but you can already see how Azerbaijani leader suddenly offered during the pandemic, offered dialogue with opposition. This never happened before. Jokai, maybe it's partly your answer to your question. But in general, resource nationalism studies, as well as Rentier state studies, they're considered to be relatively recent and not very sort of well-developed studies yet, because the theories are being revised quite often. The new elements, new factors are added and researched. So as most of the theories, it's in a permanent dynamic and development. So thank you for the interesting questions. Let me stop here.
That would all be the same. They set up a sovereign wealth fund that's called the Petroleum Fund, that all oil and gas revenues get put into the fund, and money is only taken out with parliamentary approval. And they adopted various transparency rules and checks and balances. They were the second country in Asia after Azerbaijan to join EITI. The next slide. And for the first few years, the system worked very well. They had 2 bidding rounds for new oil and gas exploration contracts in 2006. The income from oil and gas rose rapidly as production increased and price increased. So by 2012, they were getting $3 billion a year. The sovereign wealth fund was invested entirely overseas in bonds, and therefore it was the only such fund in the world that didn't lose money in the recession in 2008. Withdrawals were mostly at sustainable levels, and by 2014, the balance in the fund had reached $16 billion, which is a lot for a country of 1.3 million people. Next slide. So this graph shows that the red and white checkerboard colors is the oil revenue each year, and you can see it peaked in 2012, and it's been going down pretty rapidly since then. And the blue striped lines are the return on investments in the petroleum fund, from the sovereign wealth fund, which you can see now are much larger than oil and gas revenues. and also fluctuate from year to year based on international financial markets. And the yellow and red striped part at the bottom is the non-oil revenues that the state gets, which is very small. It continues, unfortunately, to be very small. Next slide. So in the first few years, as oil revenues rose rapidly, state spending also rose very rapidly. It went from $0.3 billion a year up to 4 times that in about 5 years. And now it's a little higher. It's not rising quite as quickly anymore. They created a national oil company in 2011, a state-owned oil company. They weakened their rules for managing the petroleum fund twice in 2011 and 2019. They've been taking more money out of the fund than is sustainable every year, and more than double the sustainable level for the last 4 years, including the budget that was just passed last week for next year. Oil revenues, as the graph showed, have been falling. And since 2014, the sovereign wealth fund balance has gone up and down, and it's between $17 and $19 billion. Next slide. So on this graph, the red line at the top is the balance of money that's in the petroleum fund. And after this year, the dotted part is the projections from the Ministry of Finance. So they project that it's going to be dropping starting next year and dropping fairly rapidly. One of their scenarios shows that it will be empty in about 10 years. The bars, the black bar is the estimated sustainable income, the amount that can be withdrawn from the fund each year forever. So it's the permanent income rule that we learned about in this class. And the blue bar is the amount of money that was actually withdrawn. So you can see in 2012 and every year since 2015, a lot more has been withdrawn than is sustainable. And the government projections in the future are to withdraw even much more than that. Next slide. So some of the things didn't work out quite as well as people had hoped. None of the contracts that were awarded in 2006 turned out to find commercial quantities of petroleum. Since then, there have been 5 new contracts awarded, but they've all been done without public tender to the national oil company, sometimes with another partner. Diversification of the economy away from oil has not worked very well. There's a lot of dreams and talk of a huge petroleum infrastructure project on the South Coast, but many people, including myself, feel that it's not economically viable and it would have much higher costs and risks than its benefits. And they've had a number of foreign advisors that were either incompetent or corrupt, creating bad relationships with the oil companies, and politics has often gotten in the way of good governance. Next slide. So this is the non-oil GDP, and what you can see is, except for the top 2 bars, which are construction and public administration, it hasn't really changed in the 17 years since independence. And the top 2 bars are largely fueled by government spending. The black line shows how rapidly government spending went up. And that's when the non-oil GDP went up. And so many people feel, and we can see it actually this year in 2020, that as government spending drops, the GDP will also drop. And considering that there are still very high levels of poverty and malnutrition, that's very worrisome. Next slide. So the sovereign wealth fund is paid for about 86% of all state expenses, and still does. And as I mentioned, it could be empty in 10 years. A lot of that money has been used to build highways, airports, centralized electricity system that don't benefit most of the public. The country is very dependent on imports, and people who have the means or the political connections can get education or healthcare overseas, but most of the population doesn't have access to quality education or healthcare or water supply or even good nutrition. Malnutrition in Timor-Leste is among the highest in the world. Next slide. So what we see happening right now is that there's a lot of talk about other oil and gas reserves, but they're either very small or they may not exist. That the idea that the petroleum industry would provide jobs and some contracts for Timorese people and companies has not happened. I don't have time to talk about the the one big field that's not yet developed, but it's become a politicized issue rather than an economic issue. And money has been taken out of the petroleum fund by the national oil company in order to get involved in that project. And what we've seen is that the preferences of the heroes of the independence struggle often have more influence on policy than facts and evidence. Next slide. So the lessons that we can learn from Timor-Leste's experience that may be applicable in other places, that you can set up all the good laws that you want, but it's always possible to revise laws and change them. That it's much easier for a government to live off oil rents than it is to do the work of actual economic development, and the same way for the citizens. That legitimate foreign investors don't want to get involved in projects that don't make money. That shouldn't be obvious, but it seems to be something that have to be learned. Or projects where they don't trust the people they're negotiating with. That actual policy based on evidence and comparing things and evaluating things based on the actual numbers often get less importance than what people would like to see happen, or their loyalty to a particular person or particular political party. That in a democracy where a government has to go to election, and Timor-Leste it's every 5 years, has no incentive to plan for long term. The political leaders don't, because they won't be in office in the long term. If they don't produce results in the short term, they won't get reelected. And finally, that nationalism can be a more important factor than pragmatism, than reality in making policy. Next slide. And then there are other things that are specific to Timor-Leste that maybe apply in some countries, but probably not in most countries. During their 24 years of struggle against the Indonesian occupation, everybody in the world told them you'd never be independent, but they are independent. So now they don't believe advice and don't believe that there's anything that they cannot do. That the skills of leading in a peacetime democracy, of coalition building, consultation, are different than the skills you need in an underground military resistance. But the leaders of the resistance are the national heroes, and they will be the political leaders for as long as they want to be. When people have lived through an experience where any day somebody was going to come in and kidnap them or murder them or rape them or burn their house down, they don't think very much about what's going to happen next year or next decade. So sustainability is not really a factor. That when no one has lived under a consultative democracy, neither leaders nor citizens, it takes time to learn how that works. And that's borne out by the experience of almost every country that comes out of a long period of foreign domination and a long resistance struggle. And finally, that a lot of incompetent international advisors came to Timor-Leste and didn't know what they were doing. And so many Timorese policymakers think that there's no such thing as expertise. If the experts don't know, then we might as well just try with whatever little we know. Next slide, please. So I've been working on this for a long time with an organization called Lahamutuk, and our website has more information. And Timor-Leste is a very young country, and women are becoming finally recognized as human beings. And so I wanted to remind us all that it's the people that are more important than the oil or the money or the governments. Thank you. So I don't know if we have time for questions or discussion, or if we just want to go to the next presentation.
Yeah, as you want. I mean, I just wanted to say how much I appreciate this presentation, because it's not only discovering a new country, which we know very little about, but it's also very thorough research, and you have so many years and high professionalism, and this is just a really very valuable study. I was very interested in central bank. You meant it is a state entity, right? But you said it was independently managed, so...
Yeah, the central bank was set up actually before independence, during the UN administration, with a lot of support from the IMF to manage currency, but then when the petroleum fund was set up, they were given the responsibility for being the operational manager. So decisions about how much to take out of the fund and how the fund is invested in broad terms are made by the Ministry of Finance, by the political system. But the day-to-day management, the contracting with external stockbrokers and managers, the reporting on a monthly and quarterly basis is handled by the central bank. And they've done a very professional job over the years. But when there's been political pressure to maybe break the rules, they have not been as strong as some of us would have hoped they would have been.
Okay. Well, I suggest then we move to the next presentation. And
Gubad says he has a question in the chat.
Yeah, okay.
I have some question for the clarification.
I couldn't find Samaya. I don't have your presentation in my files, unfortunately. I didn't receive it. You mean PowerPoint presentation? I just received Charlie's presentation just now, but yours probably will arrive later. Could you maybe send it to Gubad Ibadoghlu, your presentation?
I received it. Let me just, I want to open. No.
Just Charlie, to let you know about women, the last point of yours is that recently I listened to a very interesting report about how Bangladesh made enormous breakthrough in terms of economic growth because it developed the sectors of economy where the women are major labor force. So women are making, a major breakthrough in economic growth in countries like Bangladesh, and then in Japan. Japan is also planning womenomics or something like that. So, okay, so we have the next one with Sumaya. Sumaya, the floor is yours.
And before starting the Somaya presentation, I have the very short question for the Charlie, if possible, and if you have time. First of all, thanks so much, Charlie, for your great job and the great presentation. Really, I enjoyed when I read, and really very interesting, comprehensive report. And what I want to clarify, as I saw, there is the rule estimated sustainable income, but your graph shows that never follow the rule. Even the projected the spending shows that the government is going to spend more than compared to the estimated sustainable income. Is it right, or?
Yes, that's right.
Right.
The sustainable income, originally they talked about it as a rule, and then they talked about it as a guideline, and then they talked about it as a benchmark. And it's almost a formality. Every year when the state budget is presented, the prime minister writes a letter to parliament that says we need to take more money than the sustainable income because the development needs of the country are very pressing, and we need to build infrastructure, and they call it front loading, taking out more money now in terms of providing benefits for the future. But the reality is it's never going to end until the money runs out. So it's not really front loading. And the population is growing rapidly and public needs are growing rapidly. And so they're taking out more money, even taking out the same amount of money now would be front loading. But unfortunately, the rule about just only taking out the sustainable amount has not been followed.
And I saw also one, I want to clarify in your graph, state income and expenditure in 2018, and the return on the petroleum fund investment declined. Why in 2018? Because it's not the time of the global financial crisis. What happened in 2018?
Yeah, but in 2018, especially in the last quarter of 2018, the global stock prices dropped significantly. And it was enough to outweigh all the interest and dividends that they had received that year.
In US market, mostly, yeah?
Yeah, their fund is invested, a large part of it's in the US, but not all. It's now 35% in stocks, and I think about 20% of that is in US stocks, and the rest of it is all over the world. They own stocks in more than 2,000 companies, so it's very diversified. One of the rules, which is a good rule, is they can't own, not more than 3% of the fund can be invested in any one company.
Thanks so much for the clarification. One more, if I can, but the composition of the non-oil GDP shows that public administration, also inside of the sectoral contribution, is increasing. Why public administration included the sectoral composition of the non-oil GDP? Why it is increasing very rapidly? Means that they are going to spend more money for the administrative cost from the state budget.
Because the state budget increased very rapidly, and they use that to hire more people and to pay people more money, and so that increased the cost of public administration.
And the last one about the baby boom. Is it significantly baby boom in the Timor-Leste?
Yes, very much so.
The population is growing rapidly.
They were at war for 24 years until 1999, and about 1/3 of the people were killed in the war by Indonesian soldiers. And so after peacetime came, people started to have a lot of children, and during the period like 2002 to 2005, Timor-Leste had the highest rate of population growth, of natural non-immigration population growth in the world. It's slowed somewhat now. It was growing at 3.5% per year. But those children that were born at that time are now young adults. And so they're in the labor force, and they're starting to have their own children. And so there's going to be a rebound, an echo of the baby boom, but it hasn't really started yet.
What's the average size of the households?
Their families are very large, partly because in the past, when people were living in war and very difficult conditions, a lot of people died, and so people wanted to make sure that some of their children survived long enough to take care of them when they got old. So the figures I saw, and they're not the last few years, but a few years ago, the average woman was expected to have 7 children. That was sort of the average nationally. So half had more than that.
Thanks so much. Thanks.
I suggest that we quickly listen to the other presentations, and then the remaining time we will discuss them. Is it okay, Gubad?
Okay. Sorry.
Okay, so I think Sumaya wanted to speak, so the next is Sumaya. Could you share your camera, Sumaya?
No.
No?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay.
No worries. Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to my presentation. My presentation is about the conceptualization of the resource curse and diversification as a solution. Summarizing 2 decades of the researchers have failed to provide explanation for the resource curse because neglect in all of the researchers neglect additional sources of windfall revenue that replicate symptoms of the resource curse. The next slide, please. I cannot hear you. We have a different resource stream. We can see that we have a concentrated natural resource rent, diffuse natural resource rent, which all of the resources researchers just focus on these two resource rent, and they ignore regulatory rent, labor rent, and geopolitical rent. We can see that each of these rent sources can compromise 10 to 20% of the GDP or more, and can potentially this rent can deviate the economy and have very devastating effect in our economy. Next slide. Some stylized fact about this rent stream can be like, for example, we can see the scale of this rent in our economy, and the degree of rent concentration. For example, in the natural concentrated rent is very high, and also in the regulated rent is very high, and but in the diffuse and labor rent is very low, and volatility it's very high in the concentrated, and in the other case the volatility is moderate, and in the geopolitical rent the volatility of in economy is very low. Next slide. The economic impact and political impact of these rent sources is, for example, in the investment efficiency is falling in the concentrated, and in the, for example, in the crop land resource rent is very is high, and also labor rent for the investment efficiency is very high, and the GDP growth is decelerating in the when we have a natural resource rent, but and when we have diffuse rent, GDP growth is rapid, and also when we take into our consideration the political impact in our economy, we see that the government is very self-reliant on social capital when they have natural resource rent, but when they have diffuse natural resource rent, they are very high and dependent on their social capital. And also proliferation of social group is very limited in the natural resource rent, concentrated natural resource rent, but is very high in the labor rent and diffuse natural resource rent. The next. We can explain this natural resource rent in our economy with a rent-driven development model, which include a low rent competitive diversification and high rent stable trap model. By these two, I mean that low rent competitive model is associated with sustainable economic growth, whereas in the high rent stable trap model leads to growth collapses in oil exporting countries. Elite incentive in a low rent competitive diversification model is they politic strive to translate from the developmental state to growth in the economy. Also, the hard budget concentrate to curb rent seeking in the low rent economy, and public they try to promote public goods and efficient market, and also it's aligned economy with comparative advantage. But unfortunately, in the higher rent, the stable trap model, politics compete to deviate rent for personal gains and lobby for exploit this budget concentrate. And also there are a lot of press for a rapid domestic rent absorption, and also lobby to sustain a patrimonial capitalism. Economic growth of low-rent competitive diversification model is in this model export. It's more based on the labor-intensive good and service export and early onset of the labor market turning point, and also a rapid and competitive structural change we can see in this model, and early onset of demographic dividends and rapid and sustainable and equitable per capita GDP. But on the other hand, a higher rent stable trap model, we can see that there are a lot of rent absorption and Dutch disease in this model, and rent subsidizes employment and also consumption, and expand inefficient protected urban industry, and erratic rent dependent growth and rising inequality. And also rent demands exceed supply, so growth collapses in this model. And political change, we can see that the structural change proliferated social group, and the new social group helps resist policy capture, and also in this model taxation fits demand for accountability, and firm lobbies for the strong institutional safeguard and incremental consensual democratization. But in a higher rent stable trap model, there is a very slow in structural concentrate, which leads to concentration in social change, and rent dependency, blunt accountability demand, and elite function capture and abuse government policy, and oligarch slant policy to sustain rent siphoning. And also we can see the authoritarian tendency for government but brittle. And social impact of this model is that market encourages self-reliant social capital, and social capital switches from bonding to linking, and increasing reliance on institutional safeguard. But in the higher rent, we can see rent foster dependent social capital and reliance on political links, not rule of law, and politicized application of institutional safeguard. We can see that as a case study, I want to say that Iran is one of the heavily reliant economy in around the world, because proven oil reserve in Iran is third, and actually the third largest in the world, which roughly 10% of the world total proven oil reserve is in Iran. And we can see that the export, we can see export of Iran in this picture. We are very heavily on mineral export. Iran is an upper middle income country and ranking between as a 75th richest economy per capita. And also GDP per capita growth has averaged minus 1% over the past 5 years, because the growth rate declines very significantly during the past 5 years ago. And Iran ranks 100 first among complex country in the economic complexity index. And compared to decade per year, Iran's economy has become more complex, but improving from 21st position in the economic complexity index ranking. But unfortunately, Iran's export is not very complex, and it's because it just depends on the mineral, which are not very diversified. The next slide. In this figure, we can see the share of the global market in Iran. We can see that the the global market share of Iran, even for the mineral, it's decreasing a lot. and it's very worrying because Iran's export dynamic is not very very diversified and in more dependent on chemical, which is very worrying for the economy. And we can see that it is how we can diversify our economy. The economy growth is driven by diversification into new products that are incrementally more complex. Iran has added 11 new products since 2003, and this product contributed $19 in income per capita in 2018. Iran has diversified in too few products to contribute to substantial income growth. And we can see that we have just iron ores and concentrated for have this comparative advantage to export to other countries or some vegetables. This is that's. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samay, for your great presentation. So interesting. And who's going to be first speakers?
Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting, particularly the various angles and the very good presentation of the theory in a very sort of comprehensive and easily sort of perceived way. And Mert, are you ready? Jokai, I thought that would be, yeah. Yes, Mert is ready. I unfortunately didn't receive your presentation, Mert.
Hello, I just sent my presentation on mail.
Yeah, I haven't received it, but maybe, did you send it to Professor Ibadoghlu too?
I sent to both of you.
Let's see. Yes. Something is wrong with my email.
I didn't receive your presentation, Mert. I received only your publication, your research paper. Could you send the presentation as well?
I just sent it maybe 5 minutes or 6 minutes later. You will receive it.
Let me check one more time.
Maybe you just start speaking without it, or can you just speak without PowerPoint, or you should?
I can try. I can try.
But resend me. Whenever I receive, I will open.
I received. Okay, good. Okay. I hope I will.
Okay, please also you send right now your presentation. I will prepare.
Yes. Okay, it will take just a minute.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Okay.
I also received my presentation.
I'm already sort of downloading it, so it will be probably quicker. So
Okay, that's nice.
Yeah. Upload. It's converting file. It was not in PDF. It was PowerPoint. Yeah, we need to. Yeah.
I remember I sent it.
Yes, it's
PDF.
okay. You can start, Mert.
Okay. Okay. My as you know, I don't know, but I've started to participate at the course from the fourth week of the lesson. So generally, I don't have this much control as Charlie has. And so I'm going to do my presentation based on the Michael L. Ross book, one of the book of the oil course, how petroleum shapes the states and the democracy and the development. So I think we can start. Well, let's start with the resource curves. As you know, resource curves means even though having a geographical advantage, the undemocratic states, the governments are not getting benefit from it. They are doing it as a instead of taking profit from them, they are just only focusing on one sector, one resource sector, petroleum sector, and that harms that harms the state's economy. We can move to the next slide.
Okay.
Price of oil. Since the Arabi-Israeli war occurred, the OPEC member states tackle a nationalization in drilling petroleum, and the internal dynamics, the domestic political crisis had a tremendous on the oil prices. Oil prices rose drastically 3 times in the 1970s. 1971 Libya jump, the Libyan coup d'etat. 1979 Iran boom, Iranian revolution, and as a result of these internal dynamics of oil exporting states, oil prices rose sharply again in 1990. Oil has a global implication. We can move to the next one. Oil revenues has a significant impact on how to use these revenues. Fiscal policies are has a significant importance for to diversify the government's expenditure. In 1970, OPEC member countries adopted a nationalization movement in petroleum sector. Before the 1970s, petroleum was dominated by Seven Sisters, the world's biggest oil companies. But because of the states with natural resources, rich natural resources, has some domestic internal affairs. They adapted to nationalization movement, and they denied the Seven Sisters dominance. We can move to the next one. Oil revenues and nationalization again. In the very beginning of the nationalization movement among the OPEC member countries, the OPEC member countries gained a greater control over their national assets at the very beginning. They began to capture a much larger share of industry's profits. In the 1970s, they also were able to raise work prices to record levels, sparking an unprecedented transfer of wealth from oil importing states to oil exporting states. Nationalization transformed the finance of oil-producing states. The size of government revenues grew dramatically at the beginning, giving rulers access to unprecedented inflows. States who adopted nationalization choose the path to fund themselves by selling their national companies instead of collecting taxes. Thus, as a result of this, states choose the way of not collecting taxes. They choose to getting their revenues from oil and natural resources. This implies nature resource curse and Dutch disease. We can move to the next one. But few years later, after the nationalization has adopted, authoritarian governments appeared more with lack of stability, large size, unusual source, and secrecy. And democratic governments and volatility in prices of petroleum caused the decreasing income revenue of oil-producing states. We see a graph here at the very beginning of the 1970s. As you can see, the median income of oil-producing states were at the peak level of their income, but years later, you can observe that it's drastically decreasing. We can move to the next one. More petroleum, less democracy was one of the points that Michael L. Ross was on about. Oil has not always been an impediment to democracy, as long as although the petroleum links less democracy, this doesn't mean that it is impediment for democracy. But with the nationalization of petroleum and wave of democracies across the globe from the late 1970s to late 1990s, the democracy gap between oil states and non-oil states grew ever wider. There are some beneficial factors for democracy that are good among academicians. Higher incomes implies that they become more likely to transit to democracy, and also slow economic growth. According to some resources, autocratic governments are more likely to become democracies in the face of economic crisis. As you can see, this graph is a normal democracy trend. All of the states by the years are going have tendency to get democratic. We can move to the next one. And also we can see here that countries with natural resources, oil producing countries does not have a tendency to transition to democracy. Petroleum, another important point about it the gender inequality, the petroleum perpetuates patriarchy. Generally, while a country gets richer, women naturally gain more opportunities, both in economic and political meaning. But this does not happen in countries who gets rich by selling petroleum. Especially in the MENA area, there are few women employed in parliaments. Most of the time, law studies of Middle Eastern women blame on the region of Islamic or Arab heritage. Yet we can observe this patriarchal system in all around the world. Why do women join the labor force in some countries but not in others? Also a good point to discuss. One factor is discrimination. The first obstacle is discrimination, sometimes rooted in a country's culture, sometimes in its laws, and sometimes in both, where it is most severe. Women are discouraged from working by both their relatives, who do not want them to interact with strangers. The second obstacle is women often have little political influence and hence cannot persuade lawmakers to enact and enforce reforms. Finally, the organization of economy make a difference. Since the early days of the Industrial Revolution, millions of women have entered the workforce by taking low-paying jobs in factories that produce textiles, garments, and countless other inexpensive goods for world markets. The last point of the slide is oil-based violence, the civil war, civil conflict in another name. Among low and middle-income countries, oil producers are more than twice as likely to have civil wars. Most oil-related conflicts are small, although a handful, such as the recent wars in Iraq, Angola, and Sudan, have been much bloodier. As oil is extracted from ever poorer countries, the danger of petroleum-fueled civil wars will almost certainly rise. In a nutshell, although the oil of nationalization has merged in 1970s, oil producing nations have had less majority rule government, less employment opportunities, and undemocratic and gender inequality, more civil wars and unstable financial developments than the rest of the world. Often the resource course and geography is linked. Geography doesn't mean, but it doesn't mean that geography is a destiny. Oil has ended up a curse because the incomes that it produces for governments are abnormally large, don't come from bordering citizens, change capriciously, and are easy to conceal from open investigation. Most of these qualities can be changed by citizens, governments, universities, and indeed consumers in oil importing nations. The result of petroleum wealth are different nowadays than they were within the past, and they can learn once more in the future, perhaps for the way better. So thank you for listening to me.
Very good, thank you. You changed the topic, and it's much more interesting now.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very good. I like the the new topic. Yes.
He moved from my topic to yours.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes. Well, I wish you a lot of success in your future career, and we will probably have more questions, but now it's time for Jokai. Yeah, Jokai, you turn.
Hello, can I start?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We're waiting.
Sorry, my presentation was not ready. I thought PowerPoint probably not working. So my paper was my topic was the effect on natural resources in Burma democracy movement and also peace process. It was something I tried to write about. So yeah, let me give you the very briefly about the Burma. The Burma is it's a very rich in natural resources, and one of the resource-rich country in Southeast Asia. We have oil and gas, minerals, and timbers, gold, and then so Burma is one of the major gas export country in the regions. So Burma gas export to Thailand and China through the pipelines. Yeah, Burma still got a gas export reach more than the 50% of the total export income, and also Burma's oil and gas GDP also represent about the oil and gas FDI, and oil and gas also represent about 30% of the total FDI. So I would say these natural resources, oil and gas, and included the J export to China is more than $1 billion annually. So Burma also receive about 3 billion annually from the oil and gas export to Thailand and China. But however, Burma is still very poor, and we still have a lot of problems, like the civil war, one of the longest civil war in the world, more than 70 years. And then the corruption level is still very high. It's 138 out of the 185 or something. So yeah, the corruption problem and the government lack of lack of the institutions, and then there are many corruptions, and then still no institutions for the management of oil and gas or natural resources. As the the revenue still missing from the oil and gas part, and then also from the export to China especially. So in this case, I would say that the Burma is still, I would say the Burma is one of the resource scarce country, because they have many characteristics of the resource scarce apply to Burma, so I would say. And then, so since the 1962, Burma got we have a military regime, and until the 2010 election. So, but military is still in power. Military still take control of the 25% of the parliamentary seat, and also 3 ministry without the electing. So yeah, somehow Burma changed this since the 2010. So, and then we call it kind of a civilian government. Since when the civilian government came to power, so many, especially the many oil companies, is one of the first set the foreign direct investment come into Burma. Before it was kind of closed country, economic session from the West, from the US and EU. But that time was only China. China is one of the major support of the military regimes. I mean, they take the natural resources, and they also want to have investment in Burma, and they give political support to Burma military regimes. So without this China support and without this natural resource revenue, Burma regime probably might not survive, probably have fallen down maybe 2 decades ago. But somehow Burma regime survives because I would say this natural resource revenue, especially for the gas export. So during this military regime time, they have 3 offshore gas discovery, a big one. So that they got more than $1 billion from export, gas export to Thailand. So a lot of money from the oil and gas make it kind of failing the Burma democracy movement because regime will receive or they go support, get a support from political support from China, Russia, and then Thailand, some other country, and then they go survive with this oil and gas export and also GS export to China. So yeah, since 2010 election, I mean that so-called Burma changes, but not really changes. But still, all the same problems still happening. The civil war still ongoing. It's become worse than before. But the peace process started since 2012, but somehow it's kind of so not really working well, peace process. So but the foreign direct investment in the natural resources sector, especially the oil and gas, is really increasing since the 2010. And so especially this time is the company from the West, including from China and from the American oil companies, and also Norway, and even the many European companies invested. There was about more than 40 onshore and offshore blocks provided to foreign countries since the 2010 in 10 years. So, well, yeah, let me conclude. So my point is, I mean, I tried to write my paper was this resources revenue still make it the Burma military regime survive for a long time and until now. So Burma is still working under this military drafted constitution, and then still many things, many problems still remain since even though we had an election, but still the problem, the ethnic problem and civil war still remain, and all the corruption is same problem is the problem in the military regime time. So yeah, so my point is that this resources revenue is really making the Burma's democracy transitions difficult, and also the Comins and the stop the civil war, because many civil war also happen around the natural resource area, especially the resource and natural resources is in the ethnic states, probably around more than 70% of the natural resources is in the ethnic area. So yeah, I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's very impressive, Jokai. Again, this is a new country for us, and it's the best illustration of the whole course, actually, what you just said. So we found, I find a lot of very interesting things which support, certain theoretical issues which are there, but also it puts some new questions, and it will be very interesting, actually, if we all stay in touch. And this course is also about networking, so it's very nice that now we know people in different countries of the world, and if you need something both from us, and I'll be also very happy to host you if you happen to be here. So it's related to everyone. Professor Ibadoghlu, I would suggest that we ask one question each to every speaker, just one but substantial question, I think, because I think everyone, we were like half hour late, right? So do you agree with that, or?
Yes, we over time.
Yeah.
Almost 30 minutes.
Uh-huh.
Let me start. I have the question to the Tokaye. Tokaye mentioned a lot of time the military companies. Tokaye, is it the state-owned companies? What's the differences between the military companies and the state-owned companies in extractive industries of the Burma?
Well, we have an oil and gas company, state oil and gas company, but military does have a company. Before, well, in the military rule, the state-owned companies present as oil and the state-owned company, the military companies. But military still involved in the many major business part like surveys and they have a crony oil companies. They are not a state-owned. But we still in Burma, people still fighting about this because many military-owned companies, they don't really pay tax. They are kind of become like a kind of national companies, but they are not national company. In the same time, they are military company, but they are acting as a national company. So we are still having that problem.
Thank you so much.
Jokay, what would be, from your point of view, the most important institution in Burma which needs development, like a priority, where if you had resources, if you had power, what you will start with to change the situation in Burma, which institution you would develop?
Well, our education system is really weak. The institution is really weak, and I mean, that should be that should be a good point to start. And another thing to sure that we don't have the oil and gas fund or petroleum fund or natural resource fund, that we still have no management system.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jokay. Thank you. Gubad Bey, would you like to ask questions, Somaya and Mert? Yeah.
Somaya, I have the questions, but the math, unfortunately, I didn't have time because we received today the research paper. I want to ask Somaya about the role of the sanction against Iran, I mean the Western sanction, because I saw the share of the minerals, it was in the peak in the end of the 19th, but then decline the share. What's the impact, negative impact of the Western sanction against the export of the oil and other minerals of the Iran?
One of the most important factor in declining our oil export is the sanction of U.S. sanction, and also there are a lot of we have a lot of difficulty in financial transferring, and because of this we have a lot of problem in exporting even the other kind of export. Actually, one of the most important factor in the declining the export is the sanction, especially after the 2018 when U.S. withdraw from the treaty. our economy declined very, very fast.
Thank you so much.
Somaya, would you
Yeah.
say that Iranian economy is now facing serious crisis due to the both sanctions regime and decline of the oil prices, or there is some hope that there is? What is the capacity of Iran economy to survive this perfect storm, let's say?
Actually, there is no bright future. Based on the IMF prediction, our GDP growth will be minus 11 in the next 5 years. And the only thing is that we go to the treaty with the European Union and US again. And also, I don't know, we have a lot of problem in our stock market. Actually, now it's first of all during the February it's a boom, and after that it collapses very suddenly. And because of this, we have experienced 40% inflation in our economy during these days. And if we cannot have a very good negotiation with the United States and Europe, nobody can see a bright future in our economy.
Got it. Yeah, that's sad, very sad prediction. I didn't ask Charlie my question. It was about, it seems that ratio per capita of the resources, is it similar to the Gulf states? So there should be, it's a small country with a lot of resources, but I was wondering, why do they have high poverty and malnutrition? I mean, what is the major factor responsible for that? There is something wrong with the distribution of these resources, right?
Well, I think that poverty and malnutrition is historical. I mean, they were colonized by Portugal for 500 years and then occupied by Indonesia for 24 and had a very brutal war in which people, a large number of people starved. There was very difficult living conditions. People were forced off their land. Many scholars call it genocide. And so it takes a big challenge to rebuild or to build an economy after such a long period. The Portuguese were terrible colonizers. They did nothing to develop the local economy. And so people in Timor-Leste had hoped that they'd be able to use the oil money or the resources from the oil and gas to develop the economy. But unfortunately, most of it is going to benefit the more affluent people, and the majority, particularly the rural majority, has not received most of the benefits.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, that clarifies. If I have more ideas regarding your report, I'll send it to you. I mean, how to maybe specify certain issues or things like that. So I think we still can communicate either questions and comments, right?
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. If somebody has a question to each other, you're welcome to ask. Well, I think now we have all the contacts for each other. So please do not hesitate if you have a question, or, as we already had this experience with letter of reference or some other contacts, if you want to establish here in Oxford, or you would like to get some, for instance, I can send you some literature. Charlie, if you want for your paper, you want some sources, I can send you. I have them, easily accessible, or Mert, or Sumaya. You all have extremely interesting and impressive insights in your papers, and I really enjoy listening to all of you. I think we're gonna hear your names in the future. Well, some of you are already established. Some of you are young, and I'm sure we'll hear your names in the very sort of high levels. So thank you so much for everything.
Thanks so much. Really, I enjoy for interacting all of you. Very impressive course, and you are brilliant. Thanks so much for joining this course, for your active participation, for your very interesting presentation and the paper. I hope we should stay in touch. I'm also open anytime for your question, for your any request, any discussion. I will be happy to hear you about in future again. Good luck and happy holiday, Charlie. And I hope we will sometimes also will join the same course, the same the conference. We will meet each other again. Thanks.
Oh, birthday! We have a birthday of Charlie. I didn't know that. Charlie.
I didn't know that either. It's actually not my birthday, but thank you anyway.
Okay.
So I mean the holiday in the upcoming Christmas.
Okay. I hope also you will not forget to fill the forms, right? Are we supposed also to fill the forms? Professor Ibadoghlu, probably, yeah? Are we supposed, or just the students?
Suppose.
Yeah, okay. So then, Happy New Year, and all the best. And it was really a great pleasure to have all of you here. So.
Thank you. Happy New Year. Have a great day.
Everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Khuda Hafiz. Bye.
Hafiz.
Please don't forget to submit your evaluations questionnaire. Thanks, Charlie. Thanks. It was a pleasure to meet you in our course. Really, you made extraordinary contribution during our discussion. I highly appreciate it.
Yeah, that was very special. Thank you, Charlie, for your contribution.
Yeah. Thanks, Leila, for your.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for joining us in the end. Is your exam still going on, or it's finished?
Yeah, it's finished. It's finished almost.